Okay, so the entire neckline has been pinned to a collar band, making sure that it lays smooth with the stitching line. And so you are going to sew shirt side up, and you are going to stitch the collar band to the shirt at 5/8 of an inch. And you are going to start literally right there, so the first stitch goes next to the front of your shirt. So you'll have one stitch and then you'll come onto your shirt. It's important that you find that point and be exact, because we're going to use that point a couple more times as we attach this shirt. So you start sewing. We're going to stitch the collar band to the shirt, making sure that we have smoothed out the shirt as we go to avoid getting tucks in the shirt. Again, take the pins out as you go so you don't break the needle. We'll get a little stitch wobble that comes from sewing over the pin. And then you will continue sewing until you get to the other side. And when you get to the other side, you will sew, and you will come, you'll have one stitch that goes right off that edge, and then you will back stitch, and you will end exactly at that point. So you'll start and stop at that point, and then your collar band is attached to your shirt. So at this point, there's my collar band that was attached to my shirt. There is the 5/8 inch extensions pulled out at both sides. And you are now going to take that collar that came off of the ham. Okay? This was collar that was steamed on the ham. Take that collar that was set off the ham. Remember, it does need to be basted in order to make sure that that beveled edge that you had in place there stays beveled. The pins that are poking out of this, poking straight through, are the pins that were attaching it to the ham, and so you can go ahead and take those pins out. Quick review here. Take those pins out, set them to the side. And then again, the pins that we used as we pinned this around the ruler to get for that turn of cloth, we're going to leave those in place, if you will. Put the machine on basting. Keep that curve that was there. This is a quick review. Baste along that edge. The reason I'm holding my hand up against that collar again is that is where the roll line was while it sat on the ham. I started at center back, baste towards the front edge. Now I am basting this particular one with a different colored thread so that you can see it, so that it stands out, because this fabric is quite bright and quite active. It's a little bit difficult to see what happens if I use a matching thread. So I'm basting it with a different colored thread. I will actually pull it out and baste it with the appropriate threads in a moment here, so that you can see what happened. Again, notice we're staying up at that rolled edge, keeping the curve that was in that collar. Basting off the front, off that front side there. And so there's that row of basting that's keeping those three layers so that they don't align as we pin this to the collar. As we pin this collar to the collar band. And so that would now be ready to pin to a collar band. That is now what has happened to this collar. So there's the row of basting that actually matches this one. When you put these together, you are going to have right side of shirt, and you can tell it's the right side of shirt. There's the placket, or there's the yoke, there's my pocket, right side of collar band, and right side of collar. Everything you are looking at is right side up. If you make a mistake and you get this collar upside down, instead of that curve, that favor that we've created in order for the collar tip to curl down to the shirt, it will be upside down and it will tend to flip up, and you will look like the pretty little Dutch girl with your collar curling up away from you. So be certain you have right side of collar, right side of band, right side of shirt. Okay? And then this stitches 5/8 of an inch. In much the same technique that the collar band went to the shirt, we are going to put this under the sewing machine, and that very first stitch is right where the collar meets the collar band. And you sew onto the shirt. At 5/8 of an inch. As you're sewing, you will see there's a little bubble in your collar there as you get this seam now flat. Remember, we basted those edges making certain that the favor would stay in, which means there's a little bubble as it lays flat. There's supposed to be that little bubble there. Please do not try to get rid of it. That bubble is there so that when the collar again rolls up from the collar band and down towards the shirt, that turn of cloth allows the collar to lay smooth. And so keep that in there. And again, like we talked about before, I kind of like to hold a little bit in front of the sewing machine, in front of the presser foot that's going, and behind it, giving it a little bit of tension. Making certain that my seam allowance stays smooth and well defined. The biggest trick here, because all your edges are flat and the curve is closer, is to just make sure you stay at 5/8 of an inch, because we're going to use this stitching line as a guideline in a future step. Now when I pinned this, I checked to make certain that the collar was symmetrical. So I lined up center back, lined up my clips, lined up my notches, lined up my marks at the front, and then as I pinned it, I actually folded this in half, lined up the collar, and made sure that I had the exact same different distance from the collar to the front of that collar band, that it wasn't sitting offset, because if it sits offset, your collar will be not aligned in the center front, it will be asymmetrical, if you will, and sit off to the side. So I checked that when I pinned it, and now that I've sewed it, I check it again to make sure that as I was stitching, the presser foot pushing on the fabric did not pull that the other direction. Now the other thing I'm going to check now is make certain that the tips of my collar, now that I've sewed that, I'm going to pull back my seam and pull back my seam and make sure that the tips of my collar are the same length coming out of my shirt. The actual tips of the collar are the same length, that I don't have one that is longer than the other, so that when they curl down I have a long collar and a short collar. So very important to check for symmetry as you go. Okay, the next step in the collar, we have the collar attached, sitting ready to go. We now have to put the collar band, attach the collar band facing to the shirt. And so the collar band facing is attached right side of collar band facing to inside of shirt. Okay? So your shirt is actually sandwiched in between your collar band, which has been interfaced, and your collar band facing, which is the piece that was not interfaced. And then your shirt is sandwiched in between. And so you pin those together, and I have pinned this again so that it has center back is matched up, my notches match up. But this collar band, again, has to go around your neck, just like your sleeve had to go around your wrist. So we have to allow for the turn of cloth. And so we are going to pull out the collar band facing, and we're going to pull it out a little bit further than we pulled out the cuff. The cuff we were pulling out about 1/8 of an inch, and this we're going to pull out about 3/16 of an inch. So we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to pull it out just center front there again, and we're going to pull it out again center front there, so that it's pulled out to allow this collar to roll around the person's neck as they wear it. Okay? Now remember, when we stitched the collar band, we started and stopped right at that edge. We are going to literally sew right on the top of our same stitching, and so we're going to put this under the machine, and you drop the needle literally right in this, on the same stitching line, same hole where you started and stopped. And because this fabric is dark and it's tough to see the thread, I actually stuck a pin where that stitching was so I could see it as we were filming it here. And then you are going to sew again 5/8 of an inch, literally right on top of that same stitching line. Okay, so as you're sewing along, you are going to continue and you're going to just literally follow that stitching line where you have already sewn. And that was why when we talked, when we just did that step before, said it's very important that you stay straight, that you stay on 5/8 because that becomes your guideline for stitching the second piece. Periodically reach up underneath, make sure that collar band facing is laying flat because you have quite a bit of bulk here. You have several layers of fabric. And that collar band facing is a fairly thin layer compared to your interfaced collar band, the 2 layers of your yoke that you have there. And so you want to make sure that all those layers of fabric don't overpower that portion of collar band facing sitting there on the bottom. And again, because this has been favored, that collar band facing is being stretched a little bit. Front and behind again to maintain that stretch. As I sew across it. And then when you get to the opposite side, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to sew right to that tip again, and I marked it with a pin so I would know exactly where it was since my fabric is dark. I'm going to sew right to that point. Attaching that collar band facing. Okay. When you sewed your collar band to your shirt, you sewed the bottom of the band first. When you sew the collar band facing, you sew the bottom of the collar band facing first. And again, there's that pin that was telling me that was the right side of my fabric, so I knew I had the right side of my band to the wrong side of my shirt. Check for tucks. Make sure that it lays smooth, that all your rows of stitching are hidden up inside. If you missed, you'll see the stitching from the first one down below. So make sure you've got it out inside there. Make sure both sides are favored. And if both sides are favored, you are now ready for the next step. All right, the next thing we're going to do to finish our collar is a takeoff, if you will, on the burrito seam that you used with your yoke. Again, we've got this extension out here. You have the option of sewing either with a quilting bar or with a using a different spot on your foot, or you can just simply trim the long seam to align with the shorter seam so that when you stitch this, you can use your 5/8 inch seam allowance. And so I'm just going to trim that edge off there so that it aligns. Be sure when you do that that you've pulled your shirt out of the way so that you do not accidentally trim your shirt. And notice it's only that curved edge that has to be trimmed. By the time you get to the top, they should match up top and bottom. They should be aligned. And so you'll trim both sides. Now remember, we pulled out the collar band facing a little bit further. Then we pulled out either the cuff or the collar. And there's a little bit of a variance, if you will, as to how far you're going to pull that out. If your fabric doesn't have a lot of give, you won't pull it quite as far. This fabric actually has quite a bit of ease, quite a bit of give in it. So I was able to pull it closer to that 3/16 of an inch. So if I trim that edge off, now my curves are the same size and I can actually just follow my 5/8 inch around. At this point, we need to do a little bit of pressing. We've got to make sure that the collar band facing and the collar band itself have a very firm line designed here close to the neck. And so I'm just going to press quickly right here at this edge. I'm going to press the collar band facing up. This also gives me a chance to check and see how well I trimmed that edge up, and did I really get them aligned? Do I need to trim it just one more time there and make sure that it aligns nicely? And you will do that on both sides. Okay. Now the burrito that we're going to make, we're going to fold up both the collar and the front of the shirt very neatly, very succinctly within the confines of that collar band that is sitting there. So I'm going to take my collar and basically fold it into thirds, if you will, and lay it down against the collar band facing. And I like to put a pin in there just so that it doesn't unfold or move itself as I deal with the front of my shirt. Now I'm going to take the front of my shirt and do the same thing. I'm going to fold it back and fold it again. And usually if you will go into thirds or fourths, it will get small enough that you can do this. Some techniques will have you roll it. Rolling makes it a little bit more bulky, and so it makes it a little bit harder to do. You want to try to have this area here as flat as you can get it with all of this stuff folded up inside. Okay? So you can see it's fairly flat. The area that I'm going to stitch is this 5/8 inch curve up onto my collar, so I've got to be sure that there's nothing in that space that's going to get caught. And you stitch for about 1 inch onto the collar band. And so you've got to be certain that you have not overlapped there. And again, I quite often will stick a pin in there just to hold that thing in place. Then you fold the collar band facing up over all of that fabric that you have just folded up, just rolled up. Make sure that it lays smooth, and you are going to stitch this from the collar band side, or the side that is interfaced, because you can see, again, the fabric's hard to see on, but there's the end mark where I sewed the collar, and I said be sure you stop so you can see where the stitching ended, and you can see where the stitching ended here, where you were stitching, where you stitched the collar band to your shirt. Those points become very important. So we're going to pin that together, and we're going to do that to both sides. All right, so they're both pinned. This is that edge of the collar, the front end of that collar band, with both my shirt and my collar folded up very neatly and very compactly as much as I can inside of that area. And there is the end of my stitching where the collar band attached to my shirt, and here's the end of the stitching where the collar attached to the collar band. And what I'm going to do is literally start in that very spot, come up around this corner, and then sew 1 inch over the top of that space. Okay? Because it's a fairly tight curve, I'm going to lower my stitch length just a little bit, not to reinforcement, but just a little bit shorter than regulation stitching. And I drop that needle in. And all that shortening the stitch length is doing for me is making it so when this curve is pulled right side out, with the stitches being a little bit closer together, I will get a smoother curve. It won't tend to stop sign or have little poked edges that you can see in the curve, because the stitch length was longer than it needed to be. You'll see if you come around that curve, you literally line right up with the stitching, and you sew right on top of the stitching line. I'm sewing through the collar band, the interfacing, the collar that's rolled up inside of there, just the seam allowance. The rest of the collar's tucked down in here, and the collar band facing. And I only go just about 1 inch. I can't go any further, or I will be sewing on top of that collar that I rolled up to fit inside of there. And so you will do that on both sides. On one side you'll start at the point and go up. On the other side you will start actually on top of the seam allowance and head down around the curve, unless you want to sew on the opposite side and use on the opposite side of the presser foot and use the opposite side of the stitch plate. not want that to come undone. So I'm getting on top of my stitching here. I stay on the stitching, and now in this one I'm heading down the curve now. Until I exactly meet that spot, and then I backstitch to reinforce that corner. Okay, at this time you do a little bit of pre-trimming. Don't totally trim and grade it, but this little curved area here, that first step again, when you trim and grade, is to cut along the basting so everything gets trimmed to 3/8 of an inch. And so we're going to just do that just on the curve, on that curved area that we sewed. We don't want to fully trim and grade because if there's a problem, we want to have a little bit more seam allowance to work with still. So all I'm doing is just trimming right on that basting line and trimming off that 3/8 of an inch. And now we pull the collar and the front of the shirt out from inside of that burrito. There's my pin. There it is. And just look and see if what we have is workable or if we need to do some restitching. And so where the curved edge of that collar band comes up, it should literally meet the front of your button band straight. You don't want any fabric sticking out, and you don't want your button band to be tucked back in. And so you want to check that, make sure it's aligned. Now, you'll have a lot of bulk in there right now. It's still, don't worry about that. We're going to pull it back inside and trim and grade further, but we're just checking to see, is my alignment good, so that when I do trim and grade, I've got something I'm going to be pleased with. So we'll take those two pins out, pull out the other side.
So I had to like scrap everything, and then it was just like really bad and messy.
And check and make sure again that you're pleased with your alignment. Okay? And if you are, then the next thing we're going to do is check for symmetry. We're going to set collar band side 1 to side 2. Check and make sure that the two collars come out at the same point, that they're the same length, and that the front of the shirt comes up and aligns. And if it does, and you're pleased with both of your curves, and again, you might have a couple of spots that look like they're a little bit pokey, but that's because we're not trimmed and graded. We still got quite a bit of bulk in there. If you're pleased with that, then you pull it all back out again, push it back right sides out, or right sides together, excuse me, push it back out right sides together, and we will truly trim and grade the entire collar band. Okay, so after you're sewn, then you're going to do some trimming and grading. The first thing that you will do is trim around your collar band, the piece that was interfaced. You will trim around that on your basting stitch so that you have left 3/8 of an inch. And every seam gets trimmed to 3/8. Then you need to grade, and your collar band will stay at 3/8 of an inch. The shirt that is sandwiched in between goes to 5/16, and your collar band facing goes to 1/4 of an inch. And so I have trimmed those around. And then on the collar side, you have the collar band that was 3/8 of an inch, and your collar band now gets trimmed to 5/16. The piece that does not get trimmed at all is the section that has not been sewn yet, the top of your collar band facing, that has the double notches. You do not trim that at all, so you actually are going to just cut straight in, and you can see my cut here, where I cut in and started to trim. Okay? Then your interfacing, again, needs to be trimmed as close as you can get to your interfacing. You can now do that because when we trimmed this, we trimmed on our stitching line, and that released the interfacing from the fabric so that I can actually trim, just like we did with the collar, trim that interfacing down to as close to the stitching as you can get it. And so you will trim that around all the way as close to your stitching as you can possibly get it. being very careful not to catch any of the fabric. And so you'll see that I actually kind of come around and grab that, pull it up away, give it a little bit of a finger press so that I can then, my scissors the right direction, just lay my scissors along that edge and truly trim that interfacing completely out of the way and not risk cutting fabric that I don't want to cut. And so you will trim that all the way around. I now have that piece of interfacing trimmed all the way around, as close to the stitching as I can get it. I now need to trim my corners diagonally, and one of the reasons that we use this technique is it takes this corner at the front of my collar and it's completely enclosed in the stitching. So I can actually trim that diagonally and then swoop cut out to that, reducing a lot of the bulk in that corner. Then the last thing that I'm going to do, because this curve is so small and in such a compacted area, the outside edge of this curve, the circumference of the outside edge is greater than the circumference of the stitching line and much greater than the circumference of the curve inside of the collar band. And so I'm going to take a pair of pinking shears and I'm going to pink the edge of that so that it cuts just little wedges out. And reduces the bulk around that curve so that when I turn that right side out, the curve will lay smooth. And the reason I pink them separately is if I pink them together, the wedge comes in at the same place and it actually weakens that seam, and so I want them to be just a little bit offset. So I've pinked those curves and then I'll be ready to turn it right side out. Okay. So that has been trimmed and graded, and now you can see how much nicer and how much smoother and flatter that edge is with having it being trimmed, graded, and clipped at that point. Okay? We're now going to do some pressing here. I want the collar band and the collar band facing to come up and lay flat against each other and to be the same size and the same diameter or width. And so the way to check that and to make sure that that occurs is to press from the shirt up to that collar band facing from the inside, and I am just putting a tiny bit of pressure on here, pulling it just a little bit. Use the sleeve board. Rather than using your flat surface, you might find that using a sleeve board or using a ham makes it a little bit easier. You've got a smaller surface that you're working on, which allows you to work a little bit easier with the curl or the curve that is along that neckline edge. But if you set it completely out on a flat surface, it's more difficult to work with your curve. And so you'll find that putting this on a ham or putting it on a sleeve board, one of the two, will allow you to press that edge. And again, I'm doing this without a press cloth so that you can see what's going on, but it is always a good idea to use a press cloth to protect your fabric, especially when you are pressing on the right side of your fabric. And again, I'm just pulling collar band up. Putting that little bit of pressure to make sure that I'm defining that collar neckline, the neckline seam where the neckline is attaching to my collar band. And yes, it takes a minute extra to press it from both sides. But if you don't, the side that you don't press, you will get a little bubble or a little ridge along the seam. It won't be a crisp, defined seam area. So take that little bit of extra time and actually press it from both sides. Okay, when that's done, you're going to lay this out, and you can see the seam that it has attached the collar to the inside of your collar band, and you can see that stitching line. We're going to take the collar band facing and fold that seam allowance under until it literally barely covers the stitching line, and it's important that it truly barely cover it. Okay? If you get it too short, you can see that you're going to have seam that doesn't get caught, and you'll have an open edge there on the inside. If you get it, so a lot of people say, well, I'm going to make sure I catch it, so I'm going to come up way above it. The problem with that, when we stitch this from the other side and your collar turns down, you will then have a ridge or a lip of the collar band sticking up above your collar when you wear it. And so you have to be certain that you literally turn this under and that it sit exactly along that stitching line. And then just give it a little press. If it helps you, you can pin it in place here as well, but we still have to trim, so you're going to wind up unpinning it when the time in just a minute. So if you can do it without pins, and it will hold in place, you can do it without pins, but if you're more comfortable and you don't want things to slip, go ahead and just put a couple of pins in it. It'll stay in place now as you move up and around. And you pin this in place. Okay. Now the reason that we came up and sewed 1 inch into the collar, you can see that this, where the collar attaches to my collar band, is completely enclosed and sewn with a solid stitch. And so I won't have any fraying or problem as this shirt gets worn and washed with it wearing out at that point where that's attached. And so you actually have some firm hard stitching that first little inch. And again, you don't need lots of pins, because all I'm doing is defining my fold line. I'm pressing my fold line in. I've still got to trim this one seam allowance. When we trimmed and graded, we did not trim that one seam that was open. The reason that we didn't trim it down to 1/4 inch first before we did this is if you weren't quite accurate, you weren't stitch perfect, and you trimmed this to 1/4 inch, and you were off far enough that you need some of that fabric, you will not have enough fabric to turn under and to catch and to sew. And so it's kind of a stopgap protection, if you will, for you to have the entire 5/8 inch seam allowance there. And then when it's pressed, then you'll come back in and trim this to 1/4 inch when the time comes. Okay? All right. Okay, so now that I've pressed that under, and I know where the edge is, I am going to now come back and trim this to 1/4 inch, because this is the seam that is closest to the inside of the shirt, or closest to the body. And so in order to maintain that widest to the world, this seam allowance, when it's all trimmed, is going to be the one that winds up being 1/4 inch long. And so I trim that last seam out to trim it to 1/4 inch. And now when it's trimmed, now I go back and pin this edge so that it can be sewn. Now the tricky part about this is the hole is on the inside of the shirt. But the stitching, we're going to edge stitch all the way around this collar band. And the stitching, edge stitching is done from the right side because it actually is going to show and become part of the design, if you will, of the collar band itself. And so we have to sew from the outside. So we've got to get this hole closed without being able to see it. But if you were cautious and you measured and pinned accurately, and you truly did line this up so that the collar band and the collar band facing are laying flat against each other, and you have truly barely covered that stitching line. When you edge stitch from the right side, you will catch this edge and it will close the hole on the inside. And again, most of you won't have fabrics that have quite so many things going on in them. So when it's pinned and you're pretty sure that you're stable there, then we're ready to sew and we're ready to do the last step of this. Okay, the last step is that we are going to edge stitch the entire collar band. And this gets edge stitched even if you chose to top stitch your collar itself. If you're top stitching the edge of your collar and cuffs, this step is edge stitched. And you are going to start in the center back of your shirt, and you are collar band side up. My collar band facing, or the hole, is on the bottom. And start in the center back of your shirt. And you're going to edge stitch, taking out the pins from the underside as you come to them. And we go around the entire collar band. We are not going to go directionally and come from center back to the front and quit, or any of that kind of thing, because it is stitching that shows on the outside. We don't want to have breaks in the thread. We want it to look complete and full and uniform all the way across. Okay, stitch around the corner. When you hit the front edge there, you'll pivot turn, and now you're edge stitching along the bottom side of this collar. In order to do this, yes, your shirt winds up in the space between the needle and the edge of your and the presser foot here. So the biggest thing you have to be careful of is not to catch the shirt up in there as you're sewing. And so you will continue around, sew around the bottom of the shirt, around the entire bottom of the shirt. Okay, so I have gone across the bottom edge, turned up that front edge of my button band again, and now I'm heading back across the top of my collar band. And so I'm now back to where there is actually a hole on the bottom side that I'm hoping I'm closing as I'm sewing the top edge of it here. I'm reaching up and taking out those pins as I get to them so that I don't sew over a pin. When you get back to where you began, you are just going to actually sew right on top of your stitching for about 5 or 6 stitches. Sewing on top of the first row secures the stitches underneath. And then where you just finished, you will pull a thread through and tie a knot. So you have edge stitching there, your collar rolls back, and again, there's my threads that are and to tie. The collar band facing, if you've done it correctly, that collar band facing is caught and edge stitched, and it's caught right along that edge and doesn't stick up or have that little lip that I showed you. Might happen if you're not cautious. So you check from the inside, make sure that it's not sticking up, and then check and make sure you didn't miss, that you don't have a hole, and that you caught it all the way along. And this one looks like it's cut all the way along, and it's good. Okay. So when your collar is complete, it should lap and meet at center front there. The two tips of the collar be the same length, and you can see that they tend to want to roll towards the shirt. We favored them and created the collar so that it would curl around it, and the collar band itself lays smooth when it's in a circle. If you pull it out, it tends to lay, or you'll see ripples on the back side here where it's laid flat. It doesn't, if I lay this collar flat, my fabric tends to bubble just a little bit. But the collar isn't going to ever be flat when it's worn. It's going to be rolled around a neck. And so when this collar is round, I'll turn that over. When this collar is round, you can see the collar band is smooth. The little lines that you are seeing here are actually because this is a fabric that was dyed with a wax dye, and so some of that is the actual dyeing process that is left there with that. And then the collar itself also lays smooth as it rolls around. And you have now completed your collar and are just about done with your shirt.